we were only open in one theater, and then people would go home from seeing the movie and email their friends and say, oh my God, I just saw this movie. And the people in some other town were like, well, wait a second, how do I see this movie?
Welcome to another episode of the Filmosophers Movie Talk Show. I'm Chris Bush.
And I am Dean Slider.
On the Filmosophers, we talk about film and filmosophy with the people who make and who love the movies. And we are delighted to have as a guest on our show today, Betsy Chasse, film director, author, best known for What the Bleep Do We Know? And author of your new book, Killing Buddha. Betsy, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So you are best known for, it was a 2004 film?
Yes.
What the Bleep Do We Know? Which was, I think, probably the most successful and commercially accessible exploration on film of the marriage of science and spirituality, physics and consciousness. Share with us a little bit the genesis of the project and some of the highlights of your experience making the film and its subsequent release.
Wow, that's a big story. A lot of which I made into a novel, Killing Buddha, some of it. A lot of the beginning of how I ended up making the bleep is true. But the truth of the matter is I was, for a very long time, a very successful line producer for really schlocky B late night Cinemax movies, and dare I say it, even porn. Here. And it was a great, I was young, coming up in production, and as a female way back in those days in the 90s, there weren't a lot of female line producers. And so I was able to really get my credits and get myself a good career. And then I left Hollywood completely, got completely disillusioned with it, and I started a company making gourmet dog treats, and was doing that. And Mark Vicente and Will Arntz, who were the other two filmmakers on the bleep, had been kind of toiling away for about a year on a project they called Sacred Science. And Mark and I had worked together in the past, and he really felt like they just kind of were at this stalemate of what to do with this project, Sacred Science. And so he, out of the blue, called me and shared with me a script, which was nothing like the movie we ended up making. And it was interesting because it was really my first sort of introduction to anything. I had just started reading Paramahansa Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi, but beyond that, I was not a spiritual person at all. The most spiritual thing I ever did was shop with shoes. And so I read the script, and at the time they were going to intercut like skits with the host and use already shot footage of talks that they had rights to use of some of the people that were in the film. And I read this excerpt from a talk that Candace Pert had given based on her book, Molecules of Emotion, which had struck me as probably one of the most profound things I'd ever heard. And I was, 31 years old. And it was that your thoughts affect how you, like, your body and your emotions, and that's how you perceive the world. And what happens is that you become addicted to the chemicals that your emotions produce. And that's why you keep having the same situation occurring. And that blew my mind at a moment in my life where I really needed my mind to be blown. And so I called Will, and we spoke, and Will was like, I don't know if I need a producer. I mean, he'll love that I did it just like that, because that's exactly how he sounds. And I was like, well, here's what a producer does. And at the time, I was literally being hired to line produce the script that they had written. And 9/11 hit, and we were supposed to be going to LA. He was supposed to be coming to LA to meet me literally on 9/11. And he calls me up and he's like, all right, forget it. I've never met you before, but the universe is saying hire you. So he hired me to make the film. And as a line producer, most of what you do, a lot of what you do is spend the money. You have to really, especially on an independent, low budget film, that's a big part of your job. And I was a successful line producer, bonded line producer, and I took that very seriously. And so I remember asking Will, well, what are your expectations? You know, this is your private money, you know, what is it that you want to have happen with this movie? And he said, I want 1 million people to see this movie, or 10 million people, I think, to see this movie. And I said, look, I'm just going to tell you straight, this 10 million people are not going to see this movie. It's like dumb and makes no sense. And I'm confused by most of it. And it's just not a very good script. And he said to me at that moment, okay, what would you do? And it was at that moment we together, Mark, Will, and I just looked at what we were doing. And I just said, you know, I don't know yet, because I would shoot interviews. I would go actually interview these people. I wouldn't use these weird clips. I would just go talk to them. And so it's interesting how that film was created, because it's really 3 movies in 1 movie. It's a documentary, it's a narrative feature, and it's an animated feature. And then we did them in 3 different phases. And so the first thing we did was we started reaching out and trying to interview people. And it's interesting because most of the big names in that space were like, no, we don't want you to talk to us. No. And so we ended up with the people that we ended up with. And we just went around and started interviewing them. And we ended up with 90 hours of interview footage.
Whoa.
Yeah. It's a lot of interview footage. And like books of transcripts, right? And we all just went through the transcripts and kind of highlighted what we liked, and then put that down into some sort of ridiculous timeline on an old Avid, I think. And then Will cut that down to 6 hours. And then we just kept watching that. And at that point in time, you know, it was very interesting to have 3 director producers. Well, Will and I ended up being the writers, but to have 3 directors on one project, you would think one did one did the narrative, one did the animation, but that's really not like how it worked out. We were different levels of understanding of the information. Will was a trained physicist and interested in the science. Mark had spent his whole life on sort of the spiritual, you know, emotional, spiritual woo-woo side, for lack of a better way to describe it. And I was just this newbie who didn't know anything. And I remember sitting with Will and Mark, and it's funny because Will always says he calls it the Betsy blow up, because they had this host. And I felt like the host kind of like narrator would come in and try to explain, right, what was going on. And I felt it was just super inaccessible. And I kept saying, we need to get rid of this host and create a character and have a storyline. And at the time they were like, that's not a documentary. And I'm like, well, okay, but it's, you know, we got to do something, because I'm not relating to this information in any sort of visceral way. It's just being like yammered at me from some host person. And even if the host is interesting and they were like, we want Whoopi Goldberg. And I was like, Whoopi Goldberg's not going to do this. So, you know, let's be real. And so one day out of nowhere, I convinced Will to blow up the host and to create this character of Amanda. And so we took the 6 hours of footage, and Will and I went and sat down and wrote a narrative screenplay around those 6 hours. Always knowing that we were going to have these little animated sections, but so they were somewhat scripted. And then we went and ended up just getting Marlee Maitland, which was a like amazing feat. It's funny because the character of Amanda doesn't have a lot of dialogue. And when we had hired a casting director, and she was trying to, you know, write up some sort of character description. And one of the things we said was, you know, we need an actress who's really comfortable without having to speak lines, but that there's a lot of sort of silence in her acting. And Marlee's people came to us and said, and at first we were like, but the character's not deaf. But this is, I think, for me, a real lesson in the way that I make films even today, which is that, you know, if you have like a really clear mission and intention, and you just check in with, does this new piece of information or thing fit the intention of the movie? And it really did, because the truth was Marlee was the perfect person to play Amanda. Couldn't have been anybody else. And so we got Marlee Maitland. We went and shot a movie like you would shoot a normal movie. And the interesting thing about 2004 was, or actually when we were filming, which was 2000, I think, 2, we were really on the sort of line between digital and analog. There was a lot of digital cameras were just coming out and they were super ginormous, and we shot all the interviews that way, but we actually shot the Amanda film, the narrative on 35, which was, nobody does that now, right? And then after we shot the narrative, we did a cut where we kind of just married the narrative and the doc. And then we looked at it and said, okay, let's go do the animation. So it took 3 years to make the film, mostly because we really just made 3 movies. And then we had to combine them all together. And then I remember, sorry if I'm yammering, but this is how it all works. If people might find this interesting, I remember when we finished the movie, I took it to all the studios and said, hey, why don't you distribute this movie? And I remember so many of them, big executives looking at me going, wow, that was really cool. No one's going to go watch this movie. No one's going to, we don't even know what is this movie? Is this movie a documentary? Is it a narrative? It's cool. I'd love it. And so, people often ask me, how did the Bleep become so successful? And I do think it was unique and creative filmmaking. And I do think that there was an honest and authenticity to the creation of the film. But we also had money. Will had plenty of money, and that makes a big difference when you're going to do something. And so Will agreed. We said, well, let's just distribute it ourselves. And this is at a time when people were not doing self-distribute. We were one of the first movies ever and it's the model that I created is still used today. I said, well, we're going to have to do this ourselves. And I happened to live up in a small town in Washington, and there was an independent movie theater there, and we opened it there, and we opened it completely backwards. Like we opened it in areas where we knew there would be an audience for it, as opposed to like LA and New York, like the way most movies do things. And we did this one theater at a time rollout for about 5 months, and grossed over $2 million. One like independent small theater at a time. And then all of a sudden the studios all came running back to us like, what are you doing? Wait a minute, we want a piece of this now. And at the time we were like, why would we give you a piece of this now? I was pregnant with my first child, and I had negotiated a deal with what was Lowe's. Obviously now it's AMC. They came to me independently and said, hey, we want to take this out on 300 screens across the United States. Let's make a deal. And so I said, okay, cool. And I had been running distribution out of like a side room in an office. And it was like 10 of us, and we had like phone banks, and we really created the idea of street teams and grassroots marketing. We were independently calling church groups and spiritual groups and clubs and organizations. Like we were just really grassrootsing this whole thing. And we were going to open like 6 months later in 300 screens. And this is the day of prints. Like, remember when you had prints, like the big reels, right? So we literally had prints, like 5 of them sitting in this office. And I had this moment where I looked at Will, and I'm like 8.5 months pregnant. And I'm like, I can't do this for 300 screens. Like I think we actually need a distributor. So we went to Goldwyn, the Samuel Goldwyn Company, and did a service deal with them. And basically we continued to do all the marketing, and they handled all of the the prints and all that amazing stuff, thank God. And the rest is history.
Right.
That's a long answer, but there you
go. Yeah. You mentioned Autobiography of a Yogi as kind of your first door into spirituality. And I just, yesterday, I was out for breakfast with a good friend, and I mentioned that we'd be doing this interview. And he said, that film was my door into spirituality. He said, I loved that film. He said, I went back, I saw it in New York 4 times. I secretly recorded the audio so I could listen to it at home. And, he's since moved on to, he's, do meditation and so forth, but that was his way in. And I suspect that's the case for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, I just got an email the other day from someone, I get them still, from people that said that movie changed my life or that movie saved my life. And that feels amazing. Like, to have been a part of something that impacted one person is like a gift, right? But to make a film that impacted millions of people, and I say that without it did. I mean, millions. It's grossed $50 million, I think, worldwide. It's translated into 30 languages. The book is translated into 30 languages. It's humbling, and I'm grateful because it certainly changed my life. And so when people say that to me, I usually say it changed my life too.
Mm-hmm.
But clearly there was an appetite, Betsy, in society, maybe unrecognized, untapped, for this kind of exploration of spirituality, bolstered by scientific commentary, but outside the domain of formal religion. That really sparked people's interest and curiosity.
What really was interesting at the time when the studios were like, nobody's going to see this movie, I went back, and a lot of people like to call themselves the marketing genius behind What the Bleep Do We Know, but it was really me and a couple of other people, a wonderful guy named Pavel and a girl named Gabby and a woman named Kate. And none of these people, including myself, we were not like great marketing geniuses or any of those things. But I remember Pavel brought in a book called The Cultural Creatives by Paul Reyes. I don't know if you've ever checked it out, but it's a seminal book, really encapsulating and putting clarity to what is now often referred to as the mind, body, spirit audience, or LOHAS is another LOHAS. And it really
wait. What does that stand for? LOHAS?
Lifestyles of health and sustainability.
Okay.
So, but I believe it was Pablo who brought the book to us, and we all read the book. And then they had done their first, this is way back when, they had done their first market research. And we went and looked at that. And that was really a roadmap that nobody else had really used before to market the film. And one of for instance, I said, because we were not tied to a studio and we were solely independent, and at the time we weren't even thinking about Academy Awards or anything like that. We just wanted the movie to be seen. We were able to break all the rules. Like, who opens a movie in a small town in Yelm, Washington? Who then goes to Oregon? And, we did tons of little theaters up in the Pacific Northwest. One, because we knew there was a high concentration of people interested in the subject matter. Two, because we knew the area, we were local. As filmmakers, we could just drive to the theater and do a Q&A, which proved to be really beneficial. But we just followed our audience instead of following the typical theatrical traditional method, which is why people say, why did the movie get so successful? A, money, and B, because we followed the audience. And the other thing that's interesting is What the Bleep opened in its first theater on the same day that Facebook launched. So it's just really interesting if you think about it. But at the time, there wasn't social media. So we were only open in one theater, and then people would go home from seeing the movie and email their friends and say, oh my God, I just saw this movie. And the people in some other town were like, wait a second, how do I see this movie? How we ended up getting Lowe's to make a deal with us was the head buyer from Lowe's called and said, I've got about 25 theaters across the US where every day 20 or 30 people come into the theater and ask if this movie's coming. What are you doing? Who are you? Literally, they had no idea who I was. And it was funny because before we made the deal for 300 screens, he said, I'm going to put you in this theater in LA That's our worst performing theater. Nobody wants to go see movies there. But if you can do what you've been doing in these other theaters, in these random places, in that theater, I'll make a deal with you for 300. And it was the Beverly Center movie theater. And it was the crappiest screen, excuse my mouth, and it was just everything, like it was designed to fail, right? And
well, I know the theaters. I know the
Yeah.
theater's really hard to get to too.
Yeah, it's just everything about it was wrong. And we had people like lined all the way around the floor where the theater was, circling the entire floor waiting to buy tickets for these. So we sold out the first 3-week shows in 2 hours.
Wow.
And I think part of it was because people didn't know how long it was going to be there, and if it was, it was that kind of energy. Where I think, people often say to me, "How can I recreate the bleep?" And I'm like, it's like the 24-hour news cycle didn't exist really then, So
right. Now, Betsy, the most controversial aspect of the film turned out to be the involvement of Jay-Z Knight, channeling Ramtha. Speaking of Yelm, Washington, and then, at least according to what I've read, it turned out that you and the other two main filmmakers were students at the Ramtha School of Enlightenment. And some sources say that the Ramtha School was involved in financing the film. And so what's your perspective on all of that now?
Well, I'm not going to give you my perspective. I'm just going to give you the facts. How about that? Because that's different.
Okay.
The facts are Will and Mark were definitely students at the Ramtha School of Enlightenment. When it was hired, I went and attended, and I was considered a student for about 2 years. Ramtha or RSC and Jay-Z Knight had nothing to do with the funding of the movie. Will Arntz, independently with Mark, wanted to make a movie. Of course, at the time, they were encouraged to make a movie. And the film was never intended to be, nor if you actually watch the movie, would you consider it to be a recruitment video for RSC. It could be just as much a recruitment video for anything else. Ramtha had probably, I would say, other characters in the movie. Candace Pert, Dr. Joe, certain people had way more screen time, you know? And it's interesting, I had this moment, I was at Sony. So after the movie came out and it was this big ginormous success, everybody called us in for meetings to want to know how we did it. How did you do this? And I remember sitting at Sony, and this woman, the development woman, or I don't remember, some executive, was raving about how she didn't know, like that woman, and she said this, and I loved her, she was amazing. And I said, great. She goes, well, who is that woman? And I explained her name is Jay-Z Knight, and she channels a 35,000-year-old warrior named Ramtha. And then the woman got mad at me.
Mm-hmm.
Like as if somehow I had duped her. And I said, so here's what's really interesting. Like, does it matter who said it? It really inspired you. Mm-hmm. It really impacted you. Though you've been sitting here for 20 minutes telling me that was the person in the movie that had the most impact on you. And so that was interesting for me, because I said that's.
And it's interesting how individual those reactions are, because I've spoken to some people who've had the reaction that she did, and some people who's just viscerally have this very strong negative, like, who is that woman? What is she doing there? I don't want to listen to her. It's no one seems to have a mild reaction to her.
No, well, and that's pretty common. And if you watch the movie and you really dissect the movie as a filmmaker, I've taught documentary filmmaking, and I bring in the bleeps sometimes to really examine everything that is said by one of the interview subjects in the movie is said 3 times. Mm-hmm. So it's like whatever Ramtha said, 2 other scientists or people said. Mm-hmm. And we did that intentionally. And because we wanted people to be able to go, well, they might, it's always about the messenger, right? People want to hear the message, but they might only hear it from a certain messenger. Mm-hmm. So it's ironic, which is why we put all the titles of the people at the end, people think we were trying to hide Ramtha. Like everybody puts things like that we were like doing all this stuff, and we're like, God, you guys give us way too much credit, you know? Like really, if we wanted to hide Ramtha, we wouldn't have put Ramtha in the movie. It's like that simple. But we put all the introductions of who was in the movie, and we never used the lower third through the entire film for two reasons. One, because we wanted you to settle into an experience, and because it was part narrative and part doc, we felt like if we kept putting the lower thirds, it would continually take you in and out of the story. And in a way, the interview characters became sort of like the peanut gallery in Amanda's head. So they essentially became characters, right? And so we didn't want it to be overtly like, this is the movie, this is the doc, this is the movie. You know, we wanted to keep it all sort of cohesive. And then the other thing was, we wanted people just to settle into listening without deciding, because we have a tendency as a culture to judge a book by its cover, or to decide, you know, that person knows more because they've got 7 letters behind their names. And sometimes that's valuable, but sometimes it isn't, you know? So we want people to be able to listen and hear, especially with, you know, like we're not spouting, you know, I'm a big believer in science, right? You know, I am not gonna go again. I don't know enough about science to claim that I can heal you, or that I know whether or not, you know, this, I just got vaccinated. I'm very down with that. And I think we should do that. But a lot of, you know, what was talked about in the bleep was a big chunk of it was theoretical, and a big chunk of it was personal. So we wanted people just to have the experience and listen. And then we announced who they were. And we had people from Stanford, Harvard, Columbia, you know, we had major physicists alongside people that were thought leaders, spiritual teachers, gurus, to give a sense that there is some cohesion in what some of the science is saying. And that was the point of the movie.
Yeah, I remember I knew who Jay-Z was. And by the way, for any of the audience that don't know, Jay-Z Knight channels, as you mentioned, it 35,000-year-old Lemurian warrior named Ramtha. So she channels him and channel for his wisdom and insights and perceptions, past, present, future. I had heard recordings of hers, and Esther Hicks is another famous channeler. I was just I was always kind of skeptical about channeling, but I didn't think they overdid it in the film. And the fact that Bill and Mark were Ramtha people, you know, it didn't come off as a Ramtha advertisement, and it seemed pretty well balanced. So just as a viewer of the movie, you know, I didn't have any real problems with it, but I understand it was kind of a lightning rod for a lot of people, and you probably had to do a lot of
people wanted to be mad at this movie. We had Christians mad at it. We were like, I was referred to as the mouthpiece of Satan. I think that the more successful it became, the more people just wanted, just like we are in this world right now. Like anytime anything is doing any good in the world, there's always going to be some break it apart. And that's just the nature of, I think, sometimes humanity. And so I didn't take any of it too seriously until people started, you know, we got a lot we got a lot of hate, and it did get a little scary for a while with having a new baby and a new family. But you know, for the most part, I've made other films and written other books. That certainly, you know, my general, I guess, way of being in the world is to push boundaries and push up against what people believe and think, and that tends to create some opposition.
Anytime you challenge people's beliefs, you're going to be a lightning rod for something or other. But you know, overall, I thought it was such a positive message, and it's clear people really responded. You know, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
So Betsy, let's hear about your. Well, actually, 2 books that I want to ask you about, and I know that you've authored or co-authored several of them. But your documentary filmmaking masterclass, I found it very interesting looking at that book. I mean, I'm married to a documentary editor. She's in the other end of the house editing right now as we speak, and just having some sense, being on the periphery of that, of all the moving parts and all the things that have to happen right, or just have to happen somehow for a doc to be made. And, so many of them that can go wrong. And so much of it is about getting the money and getting the right people. And so it was I haven't seen anywhere else where anyone has kind of pulled all that information together in a systematic way, the way you did there.
Thank you. Well, that is based on a course that I gave to master's students who were masters in documentary and film. And it was really created because, I do a lot of consulting, and I would end up meeting people who would come to me at desperate, lost in the weeds, mortgaging their homes. Because one of the things that happened with the advent of YouTube and the iPhone is that everybody decided they were filmmakers, right? Now everyone's a filmmaker. And it's cool because we get a lot of great stories and information and things that maybe we wouldn't have gotten. But on the flip side, a lot of people started off making films and they just didn't understand that filmmaking is an art form and it's a skill. It's not like, oh, I'm going to grab this recipe and now I'm a chef, right? Or,
right. It's like in the old days we say, anyone who owns a typewriter thinks they're a writer.
Exactly. And so I would get people calling me in so many different states. And I realized, that I charge for my services. I've spent over 30 years accumulating this wisdom and knowledge. If you want me to consult with me, this is how much. And a lot of these people were just broke and I felt terrible for them. And so I, try to help them. And so I put the book together because I thought, I'm not going to say don't be a filmmaker unless you know how. But I wanted to give people some foundation of how the system works and information that would help save them and maybe save their homes and 10 years of their life and their life savings or whatever they were, putting into this project. That was my purpose for writing that.
Yeah. And I was sort of, you got me nodding my head from the beginning because pretty much the first piece of advice that you give in the book is the same one I've heard my wife give many times, which is don't go to film school, or don't necessarily think you have to go to film school. You're going to learn that's, if you're going to be a doc editor, you start off as an assistant, as an apprentice, you start, then they'll give you a little scene to cut and so forth. You learn that by doing it. And you gave some good advice, go study business, study law. The other way to go, as my wife would tell people, is study humanities, study literature, learn about storytelling.
I do a whole section of the book in storytelling because a lot of people just don't know how to tell a story.
Yeah.
And well, that's the foundation of filmmaking. And I think, that's what sets films apart. That's what, especially docs. I mean, docs are just as much storytelling as a narrative film is.
Yeah.
And people just don't really, believe it or not, there's a structure to it. There's actually a process to how a story is supposed to work. There's ingredients. There's a way in which you put this ingredient first, and there's a whole system, and it works. And if you don't follow every film, if I always share about the hero's journey, go get a map of the hero's journey, read about it a little bit, and then go watch your favorite movie.
Yes.
Building the map of the hero's journey.
Yeah.
And if you pay attention, you will begin to see, the call to action, meeting the mentor, the dark night of the soul. It's all there.
Right.
And so, when you can really understand how that's how every story works. That's Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth and Story right there. So, people need to, we all have a great story to tell. It's the same in writing books. It's the same in telling a short story at a party, once you get that sense of that, that's more important to me than, and whether or not you can operate a camera, because you can hire a cinematographer, right? But if you're going to be the storyteller, you have to have that. So I put in the book that I wrote, it's not a technical book in the sense You're not going to learn about camera gear or, you know, editing equipment necessarily. It's a very like, it's really more like the class at university was called the psychology of producing. That's what the course was called.
Yeah, I love that phrase. But yes, storytelling, because people they have to see also what great storytelling looks like. So to me, that means you got read books and see movies. I mean, Yaffa, my wife, meets young people who are working on these docs and reality series she works on who've never seen The Godfather. You know, which just I find that completely bewildering.
Yeah, I would say that I don't really push. My kids complain a lot because they're forced to read these old books that are classics, right? And I've come to realize that it's really unrelatable to them. Like kids, it's hard to watch The Godfather because it just looks like this old weird movie. You know, it's just a whole different world. And so I can understand that maybe they might not relate to The Godfather, but I always try especially when I'm teaching, because there's great films being made every year. Like I'm a huge fan of No Man Land. You know, I thought that was a brilliantly done movie. Also because of the way in which it was created and how it was created, and and the way it was shot, and everything about that movie was so carefully planned, but it seems so haphazard and accidental, but it wasn't at all, you know? And so, I say, watch this movie, or I give people examples that's really relatable within our time, because then they can go and they'll watch it and they'll go, oh, I see what you mean, you know?
Right. So tell us about your new book, Killing Buddha.
So Killing Buddha is a novel. Speaking of storytelling, I've written a lot of nonfiction. So it's my first fiction book, loosely based on what happens when the least spiritual person on the planet gets hired to make a movie about spirituality. It's funny and it's irreverent. I am known in the new age, new thought, woo-woo space as being a little bit of the bullshit kicker, the bullshit meter girl, and really focused on discernment, and really focused on having some fun with the crazy things that people do in the name of seeking enlightenment. And so I really wanted to write a book because one of the things that I've been told, and I agree with, is that what the bleep really did awaken the booming industry of the mind, body, spirit world in the new millennium. It really brought it out. And then The Secret came along, and there's thousands of movies all over the place about, heal yourself from cancer for this. And I look back and I go, wow, if that's a byproduct, then I want to go back and make sure people learn that, look, you don't have to have that crystal to, heal your body. And you don't, like a lot of this is just turned into marketing and I wanted to know that I wanted to write a book about the spiritual journey is really a personal journey. And it's really for you to follow your path and to not get overwhelmed by all of it. So the character's name is Sarah. She's based loosely on me, and she goes on this epic journey in a van with the crew and starts filming and interviewing all these different gurus, and they're going to different places, the sort of meccas of all the spiritual, what you're supposed to do when you go on a spiritual journey, all the places you're supposed to go. And she's kind of, out there and silly, and she firewalks backwards, and it's just it's sort of like there's a lot of hilarity and silliness in it, but at the end of the day, she finds who she's been looking for, and she realizes it's right there in front of her, So it's just, I hope the reviews have been great. People really like it. So, and the one comment that I like the best is that people will come back and say, a lot of movies get made about woo-woo spiritual people, and they're always very cliche or a little bit mean-spirited. And people really enjoy reading the book because everything that's in this book I've been to, and I make fun of it in a way that is with love, but is also really true and authentic. And so even the people that are deeply into that particular practice laugh because they know what I'm saying is true about it.
Yeah.
You know, and it isn't cliche, and it isn't like your typical, oh, let's put them in long flowy earrings and make them have feathers in their hair because that's what all spiritual people, you know, it's
Yeah.
a very true and authentic book.
Yeah. Yeah. Cheap shots are too easy to do. Like I've noticed anytime you have, and this was even in The Sopranos, which anytime you see people in a yoga class, they're always doing downward facing dog because it's got the silliest sounding name.
Right.
Every time.
Or everybody knows what that is, or like it's just the easy thing, you know. So I'm really grateful that when people that are really, I mean, my book is meant to make you laugh and to find your own spiritual practice again.
That's Killing Buddha by Betsy Chasse. Available on
anywhere in bookstore, any bookstore.
Anywhere and
just
online.
go there and ask for it.
Yep.
Cool. So Betsy, let's talk in the remaining time a little bit about some of your favorite films. And you mentioned a few. I'll mention what they are. One is Hearts of Darkness, the 1991 documentary about the making of Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. You mentioned My Octopus Teacher, the film that came out last year, actually won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, following naturalist Craig Foster and his underwater journeys and acquaintance with an octopus in South Africa. And then also The Imposter, 2012 documentary, chronicling the tale of Frederick Borden, who is a con artist who seemingly tricked a Texas family into believing he was a relative, a son who had disappeared years and years ago. And what a remarkable film that is. Let's just jump in wherever you'd like and talk about each one, talk about what unites the common thread of the three, or why you picked those.
So the order is Hearts of Darkness, The Imposter, and then My Octopus Teacher, because that's the most recent. And the Hearts of Darkness was the first documentary I ever saw. And I saw it in the Pacific Cerama Dome. I forget how you say that. You remember down there in Hollywood, the big dome theater?
Cinerama Dome.
The golf ball in Hollywood.
Yeah.
The golf ball.
And it was the first documentary I ever saw. And so I was raised as a child actress. So I'd been on sets, you know, my whole life. And I was 21 years old and I went to see that movie. And I loved filmmaking and I loved storytelling, and what was so like impactful for me was, if you remember reading the documentary filmmaking masterclass, I say this, it's like, I think that we get into filmmaking and we have to tell stories because we die if we didn't, and we would suffer if we didn't, and then we suffer when we do. And that's really what, you know, but it's just like, you can't do anything else. Like, you look at the Hearts of Darkness and that whole process of making that movie, and it was just like, why would anybody put themselves through this, right? There's just so much about the hellscape and the chaos and the ridiculousness. Like, go get a regular job, right? But no, we just can't. And we'll stick ourselves in the middle of the jungle. You know, I've been in not Hearts of Darkness now, but I've been in some crazy places thinking, you know, I could just be at like a desk right now, but there's something within my soul that screams that I have to do this. And that's what the Heart of Darkness really represents for me. It was just sort of, I think, my, if you were going to think about the hero's journey, like my call to the adventure was that. And I didn't really get into making documentaries until, you know, much later. I kind of worked on a couple, but there was that. And then when the bleep came out, there was a lot of drama about whether it was an actual documentary or not. And I believe that's when the IDA coined the term the hybrid documentary. And at one point we were told we were shortlisted for the Academy Awards for Best Documentary, but we got booted because there was such a backlash that we were not a documentary. And because we had too much narrative footage or something, I don't know what they were saying. And when I want to say this without giving it away, because if you haven't seen it, I don't want to give it away because it's hard. But when the Imposter came out, if the bleep ruffled the feathers of the documentary or the traditional documentary filmmaking world, the Imposter like blew up the bird, and just really broke all of the boundaries that one used to exist within the way, you know, documentaries had this sort of elite sort of way in which you had to be a documentary filmmaker, right? And the Imposter blew it up. And it was so good and so profound on so many levels. And it was the greatest way to tell that story. I don't think you could have, I mean, sure, you could have sat down and done really basic interviews, et cetera, and like told the story, right? But this was, it was the, again, what, if you watch the movie, after you hear me speak about it, when you watch the movie, you're going to go, oh my God, I know what she's talking about. Because it was exactly what I think a documentary should do. I mean, that movie, when I watched it, obviously it gave me all the information about the story and it was all factual, but it actually really gave me the experience. And I think people want to watch documentaries because we're interested in true things. You know, we're interested in watching something that happened and that's real. So we can go, wow, that's real. That really did happen. And then to go, wow, that's real. That really did happen. And it just happened to me. Oh my God, is kind of really amazing. And then did you saw it, Christopher, right? I mean,
yeah. It's stunning. I mean, it's just the most remarkable premise, first of all. And then in the course of the documentary is this young man, seemingly, he presents himself as the long lost relative of this Texan family, even though he's taller, he's older, he speaks with a French accent, he has brown eyes instead of blue. But and it's, you're thinking, what is going on? Are they gullible? Is it willful? And then through the investigation of a private investigator and FBI investigator, it takes a turn unexpected, which I'm not going to say anything about, which is just like mind blowing. So,
right.
Yeah, that's enough
and
said
then the
about
last shot of the movie, you think your mind has already been blown, and then the very last shot, you're just like, I'm dead. They've killed me.
It was one of those great surprises. I didn't know anything about it, and want the audience to go see it, to see it as well. So that's really the Imposter 2012 documentary. Now talk to us about Octopus Teacher.
So my Octopus Teacher, I loved it because, again, it was really informative, as a documentary should be, but it was also, I got to go into the world in a way that really transformed my perspective on just creatures and animals. But there was something very like playful and personal about it. And again, I want people, I think we make movies to have emotional experiences. And, you know, documentaries, you know, a lot of documentaries today tend to be gotcha. And, you know, there's this like true crime documentaries, and like, those are very interesting. But there was something about my Octopus Teacher that quieted me and that made me want to live there. And while I learned so much about octopuses and life and conservation and the sea, again, documentaries have this tendency to kind of hit you over the head with conservation, you know, sustainability, environment, right? And technically, my Octopus Teacher is all of those things. It's a film about all of those things. But instead of lecturing me and scaring me or trying to teach me, it gave me an experience. So now when I think about the ocean, I think about that octopus and the octopus families and all the other creatures in the ocean. And I'm more interested in sustainability and caring for the ocean than I would ever be if I had watched a documentary telling me about how bad the ocean is.
Yeah,
so
you have to grab people by the heart.
Yeah.
Whatever you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, scientifically, neurologically, if you make somebody cry or laugh or react in anger, their brains open up in a way that whatever information you're giving them, they're more likely to retain and act upon than if you don't.
Yeah. Years ago, I learned that when I was first training as a meditation teacher, and I learned that from, actually, Chris, this was from Bill Witherspoon.
Are you watching, Bill?
Bill, wherever you are. And it was your most important points, like your 3 most important points in the talk, tell a joke just before each of your most important points. Because when the person is laughing, then they're open, they're receptive.
Exactly. Same
Right.
thing if they're crying or any other emotional response. That's
Right.
Candace Pert. Read
Yeah.
read Molecules of Emotion. Candace is no longer with us, but you can still read her book. And I think every filmmaker and storyteller should read that book. Once you understand how the emotions process in your body, then you can use them to, tell a story.
I was curious after seeing my Octopus Teacher, because what's so compelling about it is this remarkable connection that this man Craig, the videographer and underwater diver, has with an octopus, where there's an evident connection. It's not just imagined. And yet there's so much footage of Craig under the water. You think, well, someone must have been there with him. Who was it? Because it's not just him shooting the octopus. So how much of this is staged or recreated? Or so I was just interested to know that, because you never know with documentaries sometimes what liberties the filmmaker is taking with maybe 80% truth but 20% augmentation. And so that I was curious to learn about.
Yeah, that's an interesting. There's been some articles around that, and I think that again with documentaries, it's important to hold your integrity and hold to the facts, and to not manipulate the story in a way that you're trying to manipulate the viewer's opinion about something, unless you're clearly trying to manipulate there's different types of documentaries. There's poetic, there's reflective, there's perspective, there's different. When you study documentary filmmaking, you understand there's different styles, and I used to love Michael Moore until the last few Michael Moore films. I started to feel really manipulated by him. I started to feel like, wow, he has an agenda, and he's putting together a documentary, which inherently makes the viewer think that what's in it is true, right? Because it's a documentary. And then when you start to manipulate or leave out information in order for the viewer to only have one outcome or perspective, that's no longer documentary filmmaking to me. That's propaganda, or it's an agenda.
It's so interesting you say that, because I know when I'm watching a Michael Moore movie, I'm watching propaganda, but I don't mind, because it's propaganda that coincides with my own beliefs.
Well, yeah, of course, it fits your bias. So I
Right.
mean, that's normal. But if we're gonna end up in the society we all want, we really have to understand what's true. That's why I love Borat. Like, I love the new Borat movie, because he says all the same stuff that Michael Moore says, but that it's just ridiculously lampooned and exaggerated and put in such a way, but the underlying message is still the same.
So let's talk about that for a moment. Dean, did you see the new Borat movie?
Oh, yes.
Oh my God, that
Yes.
man is brilliant.
Brilliant.
He is one of my
brilliant
heroes.
And fearless.
Fearless. Yeah. Oh my God, the situations he put himself into, and his intrepid co-star Maria Bakalova.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that for a moment?
But that as a viewer, like, I think this is a responsibility that we have to make. It's like part of the reason that, like, there's a big difference between The Secret and The Bleep. I'm not a big fan of The Secret, because I liked the original Secret. The Secret that most people have ever seen took out all of the Esther Hicks work, which removed the entire foundational work around what the law of attraction really means, and it just became a movie about how if you meditate, a Mercedes will fly out of your ass. But the difference between the Secret and The Bleep is, one of the reasons that we put a narrative in there was because we wanted to show people what we were meaning. But the very last line in the movie is, don't take our word for any of this. Go research and figure this out for yourself. We never, ever, ever took ourselves so seriously that what we were saying was the end all be all. And that's why we had the narrative, because we were like, look, this is a story. Here's some cool science that may fits the story. This is what we think about it. Go figure it out. Whereas The Secret was this very traditional documentary presenting everything as facts and then leaving out a lot of stuff. And that's to me, I think, what we have to really look at when we're making a doc. I can watch a Borat movie and know everything in that movie is fake, but the underlying message I can align with, even I can totally bias to it. Whereas if I watch a Michael Moore movie, I have to go and go, well, wait a minute, is that true? Or did he leave pieces of information out? Like, I have to go and figure it out. and he presents it like a real doc. And that's where I draw the line. I think, if you're going to go out and present what you would say to be factual information, you have to tell the whole story.
Yeah.
Otherwise you're creating a piece of propaganda. And then just say it. Hey, I'm a liberal, I'm a progressive liberal, and I'm gonna make my biased film my way. That's what I'm doing. But don't portray it as factual.
Yeah. I suspect that most civilians, most people who are, not involved in filmmaking themselves, don't think a lot about the process and the conventions. So, when they're watching My Octopus Teacher, they're not thinking about, wait a minute, where's the camera? Who's behind the camera? This is being portrayed as this solitary, one-on-one experience with the octopus, but there's a crew there. Most people, I think, don't think of that. But I think that those elements, you touched on this earlier. I think what's really most important is integrity, and that the more freedom, the more expanded the tools of the documentarian become. If you decide, okay, we're going to use reenactments, which just from seeing the trailer looks like The Imposter has a lot of reenactment. I mean, that was controversial when it first started in a much more limited way with like Errol Morris, right? Who used it in a very stylized way. So it was very clear that it was reenactment. And I think that, I absolutely agree with it gives you more ability to portray the truth and the heart content of the thing. But I think it also, I think it increases the responsibility of the filmmaker to say, am I using these elements in a way that is consistent with my integrity and the integrity of the story? Because the more expansive your toolbox is, the more power you have to tell truth or to manipulate.
Absolutely. Did you watch the Netflix series The Serpent? What's interesting
No.
about The Serpent is it's about a serial killer from the 1970s, and it's narrative, but it's kind of told in a documentary style. So it's the opposite, right? They made a narrative, but it looks a little bit like a reenactment of a documentary, right? And one of the things that they the disclaimers that they put, which is something new I'm seeing, is like, many of the events here are true. Some of the names and the characters have been changed because to respect privacy or whatever. All of the dialogue is imagined. So it's very clear to say all of the dialogue is imagined. And I thought that was very interesting, because we literally have to say to people, no, we don't know what they said there because nobody was there but them, and we've made all this up. And but everything that happened. And so it's that blurring of those lines, where people get confused. And the sad truth is, a lot of people don't think of that. Whereas, people should be thinking about that more often. They should be going, well, wait a second, is that really what they said? Or wait a minute, I'm watching a Netflix series. Let's not put all my eggs in like everything in this Netflix series. It's going to be, if I really want to know, go do the homework and the research,
Yeah. There was a film, I forget now what it was. I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago, and it may have been an Oscar nominee. And it became controversial because they were mixing archival footage with reenactment, but the reenactment footage, they deliberately like scuffed it up to make it look like, crappy old archival shots, so it would match the archival stuff, and just really, really blurred that line.
When you watch The Imposter and things like that, I think people are blurring the lines, and I'm not opposed to blurring lines. I think we just have to really, a big message in Killing Buddha is about discernment. A big message in Killing Buddha is like, if it's too good to be true, it smells too good to be true, you feel like it's probably too good to be true. And that, we've got to get back to this place where, okay, I watched that Netflix series. That was really interesting. I think I learned a lot about the subject, but if I really want to know, I should go do my own research. And I can't just watch one thing and start quoting it as factual, you
Right.
know?
Well,
Especially if it's something you really want to learn about. I mean, I think media and entertainment, especially now with this sort of like real media and entertainment where everything is a true crime or a true story, because people are interested in true stories. People really want to know like interesting true stories. But I think we should be saying that's the media part of it. That's the entertainment piece of it. This isn't, you know, what you base your dissertation off of, you know?
Yeah.
And too many people take everything at face value anymore.
Right, right. The fact that we're having these discussions, the fact that there are these issues about documentary and, you know, what works and what's real and so forth is testament to the fact that there's been this huge explosion of appetite for documentary, which and the opening up of channels to and means for people to see them, and that is just great. That is something I think no one imagined 20 years ago.
Well, if you think about it, I'm going to say this. There are two films that you can thank for that happening. One of them is What the Bleep Do We Know? And the other one is a documentary called Super Size Me.
Oh, yeah.
So Super Size Me and What the Bleep were oftentimes playing in the same theaters at the same time. And I remember going to a lot of movie theaters, and I'm talking like AMC and like, well, it was Lowe's at the time, but the bigger chains, right? And having theater managers say to me, I don't recall a time where I even had one documentary playing in my theater, and now I have two. And it was a big shift, and that was all 2004, 2005.
Right. And here we are.
I think you're right. The Morgan Spurlock film was a groundbreaking, and you know, Michael Moore's when he first came out with Roger and Me and Bowling for Columbine. Those were theatrical releases, and he had a big, but it's great, and it showed that someone, if you've got the camera in the right place at the right time, you can really catch lightning in a bottle, and it's just remarkable. Some of these films, what they capture.
I agree. More to come, I'm sure. I'm excited to see all the ways in which I'm not a big fan necessarily of the doc series. I think I'm seeing a lot of documentaries that should have been an hour and a half and turned into 6-part episodes because that's what the buyers want. But I'm excited to see where it's going.
Yeah, we are too. Betsy, thank you so much. This has really been delightful. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Betsy. And join us for our next episode of the Filmosophers. We'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us on the Filmosophers Movie Talk Show. Please subscribe to stay up to date on our newest episodes.